Hello sewing friends and welcome back. I'm the Cat Sews and recently I made the Sicily Slip Dress. The Sicily Slip Dress is a recently released pattern that was created by Sewing Patterns by Mason. I made view A and I wanted to take you guys through the making process. I'm going to get straight into that, and at the end of the video I'm going to share with you all my thoughts and general review of this pattern. So if that sounds something like you're interested in, just keep watching. Now, of course, the actual first step in this process is assembling your PDF pattern, which I didn't film because it's a lengthy process that isn't terribly interesting. You may well know at this point I don't actually like PDF patterns. They're just a little bit too much effort for my liking, and I don't find them very enjoyable to put together, whereas I know some people really do love them. So my preference is always a paper pattern. Unfortunately, this isn't available as a paper pattern, so PDF it is, which I am pretty happy to do for the right pattern. So you know this one made the cut. Once that's all assembled, you'll notice that I'm not working with paper. I did actually trace the pattern pieces out. I do recommend doing this, particularly if you're working with a PDF pattern, just because you don't want to reach the point where you've accidentally cut out the wrong size, either bigger or smaller, and then you basically have to print out the entire pattern again, particularly as this one was 50 pages. So now that you've got your PDF pattern all assembled and you've preferably cut out your actual pattern, it's time to lay it out on your fabric. You'll notice that my fabric isn't folded at all. Aside from the straps, every single piece is cut once, and it's cut on a full length of fabric. So lay your complete length of fabric out flat. The pattern does recommend you use 59-inch wide fabric or 150 centimeters. I'm pretty sure mine isn't that wide. I should have measured it beforehand. I can't tell you the exact measurements, but I do think you can do with less than that, pretty standard fabric lengths. You just won't be able to lay it out as economically as it is set out in her pattern instructions. The important thing to note here is that we want to cut this on the true bias, and pretty much every single piece needs to be cut on the true bias. So normally, honestly, I'm not that iffy about grain lines. I will line my pattern pieces up roughly where they need to go, but I'm not a big stickler for it, but I was this time because essentially the pattern doesn't really work terribly well unless it is on the true bias. So you'll notice when you're looking at your pattern pieces, there is actually a giant X in the middle of the pattern piece. Now these X lines are designed to be lined up with the grain of the fabric. So one of them needs to be lined up with the selvage and the other with the cut edge, and that will lead you to your true bias. Another way of checking this is to measure the distance of your pattern lines with the selvage and make sure that it's consistent across both ends. And if it is, you're at the true bias. If it's not, rejig it a little bit so that everything is equal distant from the selvage, and then you'll be good to go. If you do really want to ensure that it is the absolute true bias, you can test your grain. Essentially, to do this, you cut into the selvage next to the cut edge and you aim to rip your fabric. And if it rips easily from selvage to selvage, then you know that it's on grain. If not, there are a couple of methods that you can use to get the fabric exactly on grain. I believe Gretchen Hirsch, or Gertie as she's widely known, calls it grain perfection, and in her book she actually does have a couple of recommendations for how to achieve grain perfection, which is how I know about it. I do apologize. Well, no, I don't. She is a fantastic sewing instructor and teacher, and she's written some really, really good books, so you'll notice that she's probably going to be recommended on here quite a lot, simply because I've learnt a lot from her and I feel like she has very basic, simple teachings that I get a lot out of, so I aim to share them with others. A final thing to note about cutting out your pattern is that each piece of fabric will have two true bias lines. So just as they have two grain lines, both the lengthwise grain and the cross grain, they will have two true biases. You want your main dress pieces to be cut on opposite bias grains. Again, in the instructions for this, she does demonstrate how you can achieve this, but basically make sure that when you cut out your second piece, it's facing in the opposite direction that the first one was. So essentially you're lining them up perpendicular to each other. And this is really important just to make sure that your garment basically doesn't twist around your body in a weird way. It helps the grain lines balance each other out. Something that you may or may not be able to tell from this camera footage is that these pattern pieces are really big. They were actually much bigger than my cutting mat, which is why I'm not using it. With a pattern this size, and particularly because I want the pattern pieces to be on the true bias and I don't want them to shift around while I'm cutting them, this is a really good example of a pattern that I would much prefer to use my rotary cutter with. But being that my cutting mat is a bit too small for these pattern pieces, I've had to do it on the ground with scissors. That's certainly something to be aware of if you do have really bad knees, or you can't be on the floor for any length of time, or you can't use scissors for any length of time. You might need to enlist some help to cut these pattern pieces out. Once your pattern pieces are cut out, it's time to mark down your matching points, or balance marks as they're otherwise known. These are pretty important, but I feel they get widely ignored, even by me, except for when I'm setting in sleeves. But particularly with this one, they are pretty important. Because you're working with bias cut fabric, your hem is inevitably going to stretch and one piece will end up larger than the other. So balance marks are going to be really important to correctly match up the curve points of your dress and make sure things don't end up looking a bit weird. Something else that I recommend is, if possible, do this just after you've cut the piece, before you've moved it, because pretty much every time you move these pattern pieces, they're going to stretch and change just a little bit. And it does make it a lot easier if you're just able to quickly mark this down once the pattern piece is cut, but before you've actually moved it. Something else is, as you'll see I'm doing, is gently folding up the pattern piece and making sure that you're not just picking it up from one end and letting it stretch out. Definitely something you'll notice throughout this process is that this requires a great deal of patience and some careful handling. It's incredibly important to make sure that you're being very gentle with your pattern pieces to keep them in as good a shape as possible until they are all sewn together. And the final preparation step before you start assembling all of your pieces together is stay stitching. You may be familiar with this normally for necklines or waistlines, but this time we're going to do it down the sides of the dress pieces. You only need to do it for the dress pieces because these are the largest pieces that you're working with, and they're also where most of the stretch is going to happen. This is just going to prevent it from stretching as much as we possibly can prevent it from stretching while you're trying to sew everything together. Just while you're sewing, keep in mind to try and not let the pattern pieces hang off the table or drape towards the ground. I didn't have all that much room on my table to do this, so I just kept them on my lap and kept them as straight as I possibly could while I was sewing this. This stay stitching is just done with the regular stitch and a regular stitch length, providing that works with whatever fabric you're currently working with. And it's just done down the sides of your main dress pieces at 1/8 of an inch. So the overall seam allowance for this pattern is quite a bit smaller. It's not your regular 5/8 of an inch, so your stay stitching does have to be very close to the edge. This is a little bit out of order for the pattern, but because I still had my machine on a straight stitch, I decided to sew my straps together. This is just lining up the raw edges lengthwise so that the right sides are together and stitching straight down the strap at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Once done, I did trim all of my seam allowance to then be 1/8 of an inch because I wanted to reduce the any bulk that I would have on the inside of the straps. And then came the turning out of the straps. Now, I didn't have a loop turner at this point, and I did actually eventually get one. I have one now, and for the life of me, I can't figure out how to actually use it. I'm sure if I actually looked it up, but for the moment I can't get it to work. It may also be that I tried to use it with a really long piece of tubing, so yeah, it wasn't really working out for me. So I saw this technique on Instagram. I cannot remember for the life of me who posted it, but if I can find who did post it, I will actually write it in the description below. Essentially, I'm taking my metal straws that I have at home, and I also am taking a skewer stick, and I've threaded the metal straw through the middle of the strap, and then I've used the skewer to push the end down into the metal straw. Now, the way my metal straws work, they actually come inward slightly at the end. So what I found was, even though I couldn't stuff the entire strap into the metal straw, once I had stuffed in a decent amount at the end, I could just pull the rest of it off my metal straw, and it would grip the part that was inside it, and it would turn the strap inside out. Next up, I'm going to overlock the bottom edges of my 2 facings, the one that's attached to the main dress piece and the one that is separate. Theoretically, I suppose you could overlock all of the seams of your dress and then not use any of the French seams. And in some regards, I do think this would make the dress a bit easier to work with, particularly if you're working with a bit of a stiffer fabric that might not take to French seams so well. I mean, the recommendation for this pattern is certainly really lovely light drapey fabrics, which is why I don't actually recommend using a straight satin like the one I have, because this one I feel didn't really have the drape that this pattern required. But at any rate, you could overlock the whole thing. I do feel that that might stretch out your pattern pieces a bit too much, but it really depends on how much you hate French seams, I suppose. And then I'm just turning those overlocked edges down and sewing them to the inside of my facings towards the wrong side. And all I'm doing here is basically where the end of the overlocking stitch is where I'm folding it. I do find that this is incredibly convenient if you need to fold something down 1/4 of an inch, because overlocking stitches, I find, for my machine are about 1/4 of an inch, so it's a very handy guide. And now we can actually start attaching things. Yay! So first thing I'm going to do after I move all of my pattern pieces out of the way is press down my straps. Now, I am conscious that these are very small straps and I don't want them to be bulky, so I'm pressing them with the seam to one side. And then when I put the straps into my dress, which we're going to do next, I'm just conscious to keep that seam turned towards the inside of my dress. So the seam should be pointing towards my chest as opposed to pointing towards my shoulders. And then we're going to move on to our front dress piece. The first thing we're going to do is sew down the front facing at the underarm seam. So we're turning it down at the fold line, which is quite distinct, and I do just give that edge a little bit of a press just to help it sit nicely so that things don't move around so much and I get a really crisp line up the top. We're also, when we're pinning, we're actually going to pin the straps into this. So you'll see I lined up where I want my seam to be, which again, the seam of the strap is going to point towards the middle of my dress piece. So now I'm taking my straps and I'm placing them in that very top corner right where the fold is, and you really want to smush them into the fold as much as you possibly can, with just a very small piece of the raw edge sticking outside of the seam. That way you definitely make sure that it's included. Something else to generally be aware of is where the rest of your strap is. I'm just feeling where it is here because I don't want to sew anything except for that very edge of the strap into my seam. So I need to make sure the rest of it is kept clear. There is a very handy illustration of this in the pattern for you, which hopefully will be a bit more clear. And once you've got both straps attached and that underarm seam pinned down, you're ready to move on to the machine. Now that we've moved on to sewing the actual dress together, our seam allowance has changed. So you're now sewing with a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance. And you want to make sure you're using the smallest zigzag stitch that you have. This will allow the stitching to stretch a little bit with the dress so that your seams will just lie a bit flatter and a bit smoother, which is what you want. Something to note is once I switched over to a zigzag stitch, my machine did actually decide to change the centering of my needle. So it was actually centered towards the right, which actually meant that my seams were a bit on the smaller side. This is definitely something to pay attention to. So if your machine needle position changes when you swap to a zigzag stitch, it might be best to just increase the length of your seam a little bit, maybe go to 4/8 of an inch, the 4/8 of an inch marking. That way your overall seam still ends up with 3/8 of an inch if your machine needle position changes. So as mentioned, as I'm stitching, I'm just keeping a careful eye on where my strap is, and I was going super slowly with the satin and the curved seam and everything shifting. This is a bit on the tricky side to actually stitch together. So definitely take your time, particularly if you're working with a very movable fabric. Once that front underarm seam has been sewn, we're going to do a bit of understitching. You know that I hate understitching, but I figured it's actually decently important for this one because you want your seams to sit nicely against the body and not kind of flip forward. So first things first, you definitely need to trim your seam allowance. This is quite a curved seam and we're just making it a bit easier for us to turn inside out and then stitch. Once you've clipped your seam allowance, you want to turn everything around to the right side, and you also want to help pull your straps out, not out of the top, but because you've sewn them into the corners, you want to give your straps a little bit of a tug and get those corners nice and neat, and then you can move on to understitching. So the way you do this is essentially you want to pull your facing and your dress piece away from each other and pull them taut so everything is lying very flat. And then you want your seam allowance to be on the facing side. And then you can go through and basically stitch the seam allowance down to the facing. This will help the facing sit, again, more smoothly on the inside of the dress and for this seam to be not visible from the outside. Be really aware of your strap position when you do this because, again, you don't want to sew your straps down. So I just pull them away from the presser foot and towards me as I'm doing. As you can just see, good timing, me. And then, you're just sewing down the facing as you go. You will find as you get closer to that strap corner, things will get more difficult. You won't be able to sew completely into the corner unless you have a teeny tiny pressing foot. And even then, I don't think you'll get right into that corner. So no fuss, just go as far as you comfortably can. And do a quick back stitch, and then that's that. And you need to do this for both of those underarm seams. And then back to the ironing board. So now that everything has been sewn down and understitched and pulled to the right side, just give those underarm seams a bit of a press. I possibly It might be good to note here that if you are working with satins or more delicate fabrics, in fact, if you're working with any kind of fabric needed for this project, please be aware of your iron temperature. You don't want to burn anything or make anything get wrinkly. I do find that even with satins, even if the iron temperature doesn't completely melt it, it will cause it to kind of wrinkle, and it's not a great look. The other tip I have is always to press from the underside, not the top side. That way any mistakes you do make are slightly minimized from the outer edge. And now we can put our back pattern pieces together. So the first thing you want to do is lay out your main back pattern piece on top of your surface. I'm working on my ironing board, but you can work wherever you like, with the right side facing up towards you. And then I took my front pattern piece and I put that right sides down on top of the back pattern piece, so your right sides are together. And then you need to line up the straps with where they're going to go on your back pattern piece. So the very tops of those points where the neckline and the underarm seams meet. I'm sure you could have figured that out. There is an excellent diagram again in the pattern for this. The main thing to pay attention to at this point is that your straps don't get tangled. So it might take a bit of visualization for you to figure out how they should lay. But again, where I placed my seam was actually incredibly handy for figuring this out, because again, I wanted my seam to be pointing towards the middle of my dress. And then I just went through, I started off by pinning my straps to the back pattern pieces all the way through all 3 layers, and then I just pinned the rest of my back facing, and then it was over to the sewing machine. So then it's just pretty much the same process that we did for the front pattern piece. Again, you're using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, but as I've already spoken about, do be aware of your needle position and how that might affect your overall seam allowance. And yep, we're just sewing the back facing to the back pattern piece, and we're catching the straps in between this sewing. So you're just sewing along the underarm seam and the top neckline. You're not going to sew the sides together just yet. And of course, when you get to any corners, it's always handy to have the needle down and lift your presser foot and then pivot so that you can get a very nice corner with your sewing. Once that's done, it's just a matter of, again, trimming the seam allowance and understitching the seam allowance to the back facing. I hate to mention this again, but I feel like I should, particularly now that you're working with 2 attached straps. It is even more important to be really aware of where they are so that you don't accidentally sew them into bits of the seam allowance that they shouldn't be in. So you can see I'm adjusting as I go, and of course you don't want to accidentally stitch them into the understitching. And with this back piece, you'll now have 3 separate sections that you need to understitch. So moving from the side towards where the first strap is, and then in between the 2 straps, and then on the final underarm seam, moving from where the strap is out towards the side again. So again, this is probably, I think I found the most time consuming, because you need to be really on top of keeping your fabric taut, maintaining where the straps are, and just generally taking your time so you don't accidentally sew things together that you don't want to sew together. This is why I think I don't like understitching. It is tricky and time consuming, but honestly on this it did have an excellent effect. I was really pleased with how it turned out and how well the neckline sits, so definitely worth it. And then just want to turn everything to the right side out. This is a good time to determine if your straps are nice and straight and haven't gotten tangled. I feel very, very sorry for you if they did come out tangled, but honestly, Look, personal preference, I don't think it's worth redoing if they did get a bit tangled, but totally up to you. And then once again, I just gave everything a really nice press along that seam allowance, just to ensure that those facings sat really nicely. And of course, ensuring that your corners are nice and smooth as well. Once everything has been pressed together, it's time to sew up the sides and tackle the French seams. Now, you'll notice that up until this point, all of your raw edges have actually been enclosed, and the understitching will help any fraying in the facings, though because they won't have direct skin contact, they won't actually fray very much anyway. So, French seams are pretty straightforward, so long as you remember what you're doing. I think that's the biggest thing, particularly when you're used to sewing just regular seams or using an overlocker. French seams, the biggest issue that you may come across is that you'll forget that you're French seaming. So, contrary to typical seams, you actually want to start off with your wrong sides together. And then you're just going to pin down the entire side of your dress on both sides and then head over to the sewing machine. For these side seams, we are going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and again with the same zigzag stitch that you used before. Now, something really important to note that I did not realize in the original pattern when I was doing mine is that you should actually be sewing your facings separately to the dress, which explains so much because I ended up with my facings getting quite bulky and causing some weird seam things happening. Because I didn't really understand the diagram in the pattern. So basically, when you're sewing the edges of your facing together, they shouldn't be included in the seam allowance when you're sewing up the dress. You should actually pull your facings upwards so it's one long extension of your dress and then continue to sew up them. And then when you're done, your facings will be sewn edges together and your dress will be sewn edges together, and then you'll flip your facings back down and then sew that seam to the French seams of your dress. Hopefully that made sense, because this was definitely something I missed when I was putting mine together, and I imagine it must make a big difference because I had a lot of trouble with the French seams when it came to my facings. And then once you've done with this first lot of seams with the wrong sides together, you're just going to trim down your seam allowance. French, you want this inner seam allowance to be really small so it doesn't show through to the other side. So trim it down to about 1/8 of an inch, so half of its current size. Now, this initial lot of seam might not quite cover the very first bit of stay stitching you did, but don't fuss because we are about to do another side seam that will cover everything. And then we're going to turn the whole thing inside out. So this time you'll have right sides facing together, and you're pretty much going to sew the rest as a normal seam, but again at 1/4 inch. But first you need to give those side seams a really good press. You want them to lay really, really flat so that they don't move around. And so you know that when you're sewing up this next seam, that you're definitely encasing that raw edge inside. Once everything is pressed down really, really well, it's back to the sewing machine to sew up this final lot of side seams. So again, using 1/4 inch, I definitely recommend pinning everything down if you're not used to using French seams, or if you prefer pins. For some seams, I honestly just prefer to hold the fabric together, but pinning it is definitely easy for French seams. And again, what I didn't do, make sure that your facings are kind of pulled up and away from your dress so that they're a continuation of the dress seam instead of trying to sew them in together. This will definitely make the overall product a lot smoother. And once you've finished sewing up these remaining 2 side seams, you can flip your facings back downwards and then just hand stitch the seam of the facing to the inner seam of the dress, and this will help everything lay really flat and nice at the end. And just to finish off these side seams, we're going to give everything a really good press, both from the inside and the outside. So not quite how you would press an ordinary seam where you just split the two edges of the seam and you press it right down the middle. This time we're going to press the entirety of the seam towards the back side of the dress, which will help it lay nice and smooth. If you try and press the seam down flat in the middle, because there's actually a bit of bulk and a bit of fabric in there, it's just going to pop up again and look quite bulky. So this is the best way to ensure that it stays nice and flat. And then comes the hard part. You do actually have to put your dress on a hanger or a dress form and let it hang for 24 hours. You're basically letting the bias stretch out so that you can then go and even up the hem. Basically, one side might stretch more than the other. In my case, the front of the dress stretched way more than the back of the dress. So this is definitely where I lost my momentum, because there was quite an amount of time that went between me finishing my side seams to me now cutting off the bottom of the dress, because I hung it for 24 hours and then I lost my motivation for about 3 weeks. So all I'm doing here is I'm lining up the original pattern pieces on top of the entirety of my dress, and I'm going to cut off the very bottom edge. I would actually recommend doing this on a dress form so that your straps are hanging in the right place, because I think I might have still managed to cut the front edge of the dress just a little bit longer than the back edge of the dress, which is definitely not what you want. So definitely use whatever method works best for you here, but I do think that doing this using a dress form would be the better idea. And once that's done, we can finish off the hem. So first thing to do is sew basically a guideline of stitching at 1/4 of an inch around your hem. What we're aiming for here is a narrow hem, and this will help us achieve that. Something to note is that you do want to sew those French seams down in the direction that you want them to lay. So in this case, you want them to lay towards the back of the dress. Actually, I would say that's in all cases for French seams. You want them to lay towards the back. So just keep that in mind when you're stitching, and make sure to sew them down in the right direction, and make sure that things don't get a bit bumpy when you do so. Once I had my guideline of stitching, the first thing I did was actually give the whole thing a good press. I did find that it just got a bit wobbly. It is satin, it's a very unforgiving fabric to work with. So once I gave it a good press, everything was good again. And then I just went through and I used that line of stitching as a fold guide, and I just went and folded it all across and gave it a good press at that 1/4 inch mark. Something I will note is that I probably would have found this a bit easier if I had pinned it at that first fold as I went, because I did try and press it down, but it's satin, so you can't have the iron too high, which doesn't lead to a very good crisp press sometimes if you're trying to be a bit delicate with things. So I recommend folding it and pinning it, and then when you go around the second time to fold it again, I think things will just be a bit easier. I did just try and press this the first time, and it was a bit fiddly to try and fold it the second time as I went through. My final tip as you're going through is to embrace the curve of this hem. I hope that makes sense, but essentially I found that I was trying to get it to lie flat to make it easier to pin, but that wasn't really working. It was just making it harder to work with. So embrace the curve as you go around, and I think you'll find overall it's actually a bit easier to work with if you encourage the fabric to curve around instead of trying to make it lie flat and straight. And just with a final straight stitch, you can sew your double folded hem. So do be careful as you're going around and try and hold things taut so that they don't bunch up. But again, embrace that curve. So don't hold the fabric out taut directly in front of the machine. Do let it curve around as you're sewing. And just to finish off, I'm sewing this at another 1/4 of an inch, so it will lie just inside the edge of the hem. And that's it. My final step, of course, was to press the hem of my dress, but then I was all done. And that was the overall making process and my finished dress. So I'm just going to give you an overview of my thoughts. Let's start with the pattern. So as mentioned, this was released by Sewing Patterns by Mason relatively recently. The reality of this channel and the fact that I have a full-time job is I'm never going to be super quick with newly released patterns. I do have a general list of things to sew that I'm working on, and it almost always gets sidetracked by new exciting things that I discover. So yeah, I'm never going to be super quick off the mark, but I will eventually get there. As I've said before, if there's anything you guys are interested in seeing me make, just let me know, and I'll see what I can do. So this was released by Sewing Patterns by Mason. It comes with 2 views, as I mentioned earlier. I think I might not have already mentioned this, but view A is a bit of a lower neckline and it has spaghetti straps and it's a bit longer. View B has very wide straps, a higher cow neck, and it's a bit on the shorter side. The recommendation is to make view A because it's a bit easier to work with, particularly if you're a beginner for this kind of a project. Overall, I found that the sewing process was very easy. The difficulty comes in because you're working with a bias cut fabric, and it does require a bit more care and a bit more patience than regular cotton projects that you can just shove under the machine any which way. So yeah, this is a bit of a delicate process, but I definitely think it's worthwhile. But even taking that into account, the overall dress probably only took me a few hours to make, including cutting out the fabric. Now, when I say it took me a few hours to make, it did sit on my ironing board for about 3 weeks before I eventually hemmed it and went to finish off this video. But that's me, that's not the pattern. This pattern comes in 10 sizes, ranging from a 33-inch bust to a 54-inch bust, and because of the simplicity of the pattern, I imagine it would actually be quite easy to grade up or down depending. That being said, hopefully we might see a larger size range be released in the future as well. A bit of a quirk of this pattern is you might notice that when you're measuring yourself, the finished garment measurements are actually a bit smaller than the original body measurements. That is because you're working with a bias cut fabric and it's going to have a bit of a stretch. So you're almost working with some negative ease because the fabric will have some stretch to it. As the pattern mentions, just stick with your overall body measurements, though I will say you can possibly go a size smaller generally. I found that I took mine in quite a bit afterwards, simply because it ended up quite big on me actually. The overall pattern instructions are really clear and simple to work with. The pattern has a ton of great advice for when it comes to working with bias cut fabrics, and everything's really easy to follow. It's explained in simple terms, even, you know, breaking down what exactly the true bias of the fabric is, which is fantastic. So overall, I think this pattern is really good for beginners, or even if you have been sewing for a while but you haven't worked with bias cut fabric before. This one is a really good way to get your toes wet because it's a very simple pattern overall, but the instructions are excellent. They're really, really thorough. As I mentioned, I found this a very easy sewing process and it didn't take me very long at all. Again, the most difficult part was handling the fabric and trying not to let it stretch out overly much before you got to sewing it all together. I will say I probably didn't make the best fabric choice, however. I went with a plain old polyester satin, which I believe I got from the Remnant warehouse, who I do actually really recommend. I think they're great, particularly if you're on a bit of a budget, so I will link them down below. But this wasn't the right kind of satin for this project, I don't think. The fabric that I used was a bit on the stiff side. I would actually recommend going for a satin blend or a rayon or one of the other fabrics that is recommended on the pattern. If you go with a straight polyester satin, it's probably just going to not quite get the right drape. And I do think that's a really important part of this pattern, because it's something that you want to hug your curves instead of kind of sitting around your body. You really want to get that drapey aspect of the pattern for this to work. You'll also note in my final shot there, I did actually add a little belt. I just used the same process I used for the straps in order to make a long belt, and then I just used that just because the ratio of my hips to my waist is quite large, so I just wanted a little bit of extra something to cinch myself in. As I said, this pattern is very adjustable, particularly because it's so simple and it just has long side seams, so you can take in or take out as you need for this pattern, particularly after you've tried it on. You know, it's not necessarily something you need to make a mock-up for unless you're really unfamiliar with working with the bias cut fabric. So if you're a little bit uncertain, make a mock-up for sure, but if it's sizing that you're worried about, I would say this pattern is quite adjustable because it has two main pattern pieces and you can just take the sides in. Though I would recommend taking the sides in after you've hemmed it, because I did it the other way around and it made my hem a bit on the chunky side. So I do think I'm probably going to end up saving my pattern by hacking it into a top, and by hacking I don't mean pattern adjustment, I do just mean cutting off the bottom. So I'm probably going to do that, and I might look to make this pattern in the future again with a much softer drapier fabric. Overall, 2 thumbs up. This pattern is fantastic. It looks beautiful. I think it's really something that embraces wider hips as well, because it's cut to accommodate hips. So it's not your typical 90s slip dress made for people such as Jennifer Aniston, but if you do like that look, I think this pattern is really friendly for a range of body types. Everyone I've seen it looks absolutely stunning on. And I think it's really good for beginners who want to delve into bias cut fabrics. So I will link Sewing Patterns by Mason down below, and where you can get this pattern if you're interested. I will link the Remnant warehouse because I do think they're a fantastic cheaper fabric shop in Sydney, I believe they are, in Australia. So if you're an Australian, I definitely recommend checking them out as well. And that concludes this video. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below, including any requests for patterns for me to make. Leave them down below as well. You can get in touch with me on Instagram if you want to share with me your makes or ask me any questions, or just see me make clothing in much more real time. So thank you so much for watching, and happy sewing. Bye!